every vintage. So
lucky you.
You know, yeah, I mean, I have every vintage till about 2007 or 8 or something like that. Or so I can look it up for you.
So
okay,
Marco, we're going to start now.
Okay.
So in
we were having fun. We were talking about Chinese philosophy.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I missed it actually. Now I gotta work. Oh well. Anyways, but I'll just introduce you very quickly, and then you'll tell us about the estate, when it was founded, and then we'll give each wine about 15 minutes or so, and we'll talk. We're about to start.
哦，我们的那个耳机哦，不用，OK， 哎，我没有看到你开的那个视频号。哦，好的，非常欢迎大家陆续进入直播间今天呢，我们又一次和大家见面了。然后今天我们邀请到的是非常非常重磅的一位嘉宾，也是地中海的一个我个人也非常非常喜欢的 Terre Nere 的庄主 Marco di Grazia。那么大家我们其实刚刚稍微聊了一下就是聊到了很多，包括哲学包括他家的酒。然后还有我们昨天采访到的庄主其实也有提到他，所以呢今天我们将会非常详细的跟大家来揭露这个酒庄的前世今生，包括很多很多有意思的故事那么我看到大家已经陆续的进入直播间，如果大家可以很清晰的听到我们讲话，那么同时也可以看清楚屏幕上面所有的东西请大家在公屏上扣1。那么同时呢，如果说大家想要索取今天晚上的酒单的话呢，也可以在我们的屏幕下方点击赏元之味企业微信，然后添加我们的企微，我们的小助手呢就会把今晚的独家配额推送到各位的手中然后我们也是非常非常的期待现在就有请Ian Dagata 大师，然后和我们的 Marco di Grazia 来跟大家见面。
And but we have, of course, Echo with us, who speaks Chinese way better than I do, even though I'm learning. But it's really a pleasure to be with Marc di Grazia tonight. For those of you who saw my WeChat moments earlier today, I've already said a little bit about Marc. Marc's really one of these Renaissance wine figures of Italian wine, because he has many, many feathers in his cap. And we could actually devote 3 or 4 live stream interviews to his different lives. So tonight he is here as the owner and the creator of one of Italy's 30 or so most important wine estates, which is Tenuta Terre Nere, an Etna winery that really, not the first Etna winery, but certainly the winery that did the most to put Etna on the world map. And that's yet another feather in his cap. But of course, many people who are listening also know Marc di Grazia for having started the Barolo Boys movement back in the 80s, back in 1981, when these people such as Sandrone and Scavino, that nobody clerico, that nobody knew anything about, they met at Vinitaly with Marc, and the whole story started there. But today we're going to talk about Tenuta Terre Nere and these amazing Etna Bianco and Etna Rosso wines. There's probably no hotter wine in Italy right now than Etna, white and red. And a lot of that has to do with how good the wines are, but certainly with the estate of Tenuta Terre Nere, who has really blazed the path.
因为Terre Nere 这一家酒庄呢，的确真的是地中海当中的勃艮第，而且几乎没有之一。那么 Marco di Grazia 也是他真的是一个像魔术师一样这样的一个存在，因为他不仅仅说他是 Terre Nere 的庄主除此以外呢，他还有很多不同的身份。第一个呢，就是包括我们昨天采访过的 Sandrone 这样的名家，他们在 最早之前，就是 Marco 这样子的先锋人物，把这些新派的巴罗洛呢带到了美国市场，甚至带到了国际市场，才让 Barolo 可以说有了今天这样的辉煌。那么第二个呢，就是刚才我们也和Marco de Grazia 聊了一下，他的确是对着风土有着极致的追求，并且呢，他不仅对于哲学，对于葡萄酒然后他对于风土的这种单一源，然后它的土壤以及我觉得就是这些词可能对他来说都已经太浅薄了，因为我们刚刚跟他浅聊了一会儿，就觉得确实我们有太多的可以从他身上学习的东西了，所以我们非常期待。
And we're going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to tell us a little bit about the estate. But the one other thing I wanted to point out, which he makes probably too modest to mention, but it's very important. And that is that among the many feathers in his cap is also that he really pushed and launched, along with maybe another winery there, the concept of the cruise of Etna, what they call the contrade. Now, something that is rarely talked about and written about, but you know, if you know Italian wine, you have to know these things. In Sicily, there was never any interest in cru or single vineyards. The winemaking model in Sicily was really that of Australia. In other words, wines of Australia, wines of Sicily, rather than identifying specific terroirs where different wines could be made. And thanks to Mark de Grazia, who really stood up for this belief, this Burgundian, this Barolo sort of belief of creating vineyard areas of repute, the Contrade are now an extremely important part of Etna wines. In fact, the Etna is one of the few areas in Italy where we talk about crus, much like in Barolo, we talk about Canubi and Rocca di Castiglione and Villero and Ginestra. Now on the Etna, we talk about Guardiola, Santo Spirito, Calderara Sottana, Moganazzi, Rampante, and many others. And this is something that a lot of even other Sicilian wineries didn't really want, because they just wanted to get grapes from lots of areas and make a generic, maybe Etna wine. But instead, the idea of the Contrade is a winning idea. It creates value, it creates interest, and it's really brought Etna into the limelight. And now these wines are sought after by everybody all over the world. So that is a really important merit of Mark de Grazia and Tenuta Terre Nere.
好的，那么我们今天呢就会等一下就会走进 Terre Nere 的所有的不同的单一园。那么因为要知道呢，其实在最早的时候西西里其实并不是一个那么注重单一园，或者是说那么把风土分到如此极致和详细的一个产区。大多数庄主呢宁愿说其实把所有的葡萄收集，从各个地方收集过来，然后就做一个大区的酒这样就完事了。但是真正是在 Marco 的影响下也是在他的坚持下呢西西里才慢慢的走上了极致风土，并且呢单一园甚至于在现在被誉为是地中海的勃艮第这样一个辉煌的存在。
Benissimo. Allora, Mark, tell us all about this wonderful estate that you created and how it came to be.
Okay, hold on. Let me get a bottle. I'm surrounded by bottles here, so I might as well pull a few out.
Yeah. So funny.
Marco really has a lot of things in his hats.
This is the first bottle of Tenuta Terre Nere. It's actually a magnum.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you see, if you can read it, it says, well, 2002 vintage. So this is the 20th anniversary.
Congratulations.
This year is the 20th anniversary. Yes, thank you very much. And it says Vigneto Guardiola. So the first bottle of wine, you know, picking up on what you were talking about, already the first bottle of wine had, you know, a cru on it. And in fact, recently, starting, I think it was 2015 vintage, I believe, I actually differentiated, but only on my wines, only in my estate. I differentiated between what I believe are Premier Crus and Grand Crus. So that's the second step that I took, and it took me 15 years of trying to understand my vineyards. And then eventually, when these two vineyards consistently, year after year, you know, whether it was dry or wet or cold or hot year or whatever it was, you know, had an edge above all others, I decided that these, you know, were of a higher level of quality. Because in the end, that's what it means. You know, if you're consistently better year after year after year, then you're Premier Cru. Or if you're consistently better than those, you become a Grand Cru. I mean, of course, it takes, you know, generations, and it will take a next generation to divide the contradas, some of which are very large, into smaller, you know, and more specific, still more specific areas. For instance, Santo Spirito could easily, from my experience, because I own vineyards in two, the high part of Santo Spirito and the low part of Santo Spirito, and I vinify grapes from the middle part for a friend of mine. So these are three completely different areas of Santo Spirito for obvious reasons. I mean, it would take a bit to explain, but there are reasons for this to be, clear reasons for this to be. So eventually it's going to be for later on for people to perfect the division that, in fact, you know, the mapping out of the township of Randazzo and Castiglione were done by me in 2011. And then they were revised by the township offices, and they were badly revised, but c'est la vie. So they'll have to be corrected as well. But you can't, nothing's perfect. But so I started, you know, and in fact, I just sent out a newsletter for the 20th anniversary that kind of recaps, you know, in a way, the story of Terre Nere just until now, and presents the changes that are going on as we speak, you know, the projects for the next few years. And it's interesting, you know, it really is in a strange, odd way. You know, I arrived here on my sailboat. I sailed to the Etna, and then I kind of fell in love. It was very simple, just tasting, you know, little productions that little vignerons made that were never bottled. And you know, as you know, I was like a truffle dog for wine before that, trying to discover all the nice little jewels all over the place. And it was as simple as that. I just saw not only the qualitative potential in the wines from tasting these wines from, you know, little producers, but not only that, the potential I thought was very high, but it was the character of the wines that was to my liking. I mean, you know that I love Burgundy and Piedmont, right? So, I mean, it's not that in Tuscany I couldn't have found a great vineyard, but here I found the kind of wine that I liked.
Yeah. And
then that I could afford to buy some land here at the time. And so that's how it started. And it started, and then and if we had more time, I found a book that was published in Catania in 1920, so 100 years ago. Oh, 1925, almost 100 years ago. It was written by a Venetian winemaker, enologist, who worked in Piedmont and then mostly worked in Sardinia and built the Sardinian co-ops and organized them, and then came and worked in Catania for 3 years. Mm-hmm. And he wrote this wonderful chapter on Etna wines that in which he compares them to Burgundy and to Piedmont.
There you go.
Immediately, you know, and talks about, you know, very small areas and how they're completely different, so much so that you don't even recognize sometimes that they're from the same appellation. And it describes the wine beautifully. This is just a wonderful, what in 3 pages, he just gives the picture, you know, of what I said on the back label of my first wine, you know, that this place here is the Burgundy of the Mediterranean. There are not that many places where it makes sense to divide vineyard by vineyard an area. This is certainly one of them. And that is, you know, great pleasure as well, you know, because, you know, the diversity is the pleasure of drinking.
Totally. Maybe translate.
Yeah.
We'll let Echo translate.
No problem.
Absolutely.
那么非常感谢 Marco Di Grazia 刚刚跟我们所说的这一些包括他其实最早的时候呢，他刚刚给我们看了一下他的第1个年份的酒瓶啊，现在呢正好是20周年的纪念日了，所以我们也非常恭喜他。今天也非常有幸能够看到那个第1个年份的一个 bottling。然后呢，第2个就是他刚刚跟我们分享的他的一个今后的一个计划和展望。那么大家都知道，作为地中海的勃艮第呢，Marco 是第1个把这个地中海当中的西西里让它变成很多很多不同的规划精细的单一园。那么第2步是什么呢？第2步就是它会更加细分，并且呢把这一些不同的单一园更加细分成1级园和特级园。那么这个概念呢，就像我们今天所熟知的勃艮第一样，但是呢，其实这个过程是非常漫长的。就像在勃艮第，其实有很多的传教士，他们是经过了几千年、上百年的这些仔细的研究，然后把不同的田块细分出来。那么 Marco 呢，他也是在做这样一个非常伟大的，但是非常需要耐心的事情。那么早在2011年的时候，他就开始着手做这个mapping out 这个地图了。那么在这个地图的基础上呢，还有西西里当地的当局，然后呢，他也在这个地图上面再做出更多的、更详细的标识。那么在今后我们可能会看到的就是在 Terre Nere 的酒标上面，他们会更进一步的标注特级园和1级园的这样一个概念。那么刚刚说起了地中海勃艮第这个概念呢， Marco 也跟我们分享了，他其实当时是在看一本书这本书呢是早在1925年的时候就出版了，那么距今已经100多年了。那么在这本书上面呢，它其实是详细的写了 Sardinia 的这个一个 co-ops， 他去探索 Etna 的火山的时候呢，他把 Etna 当时他就把它形容为用一个勃艮第的平行的概念去比喻它。那么这个当时就一下子把 Marco 给击中了，所以他就觉得这个完完全全就是他所想要发掘的这样一个地方，并且呢，早在之前在 Barolo， 他其实已经对于勃艮第的这种风格是情有独钟，然后他也在 Barolo， 当时他就非常倡导勃艮第的理念，那么他也非常的把这个热情也是一路再带到了地中海的 Etna， 所以我们也非常非常的高兴今天能够让他来跟我们分享他的一些见解。Thank you, Marco.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So we will be able to see on the label when we have like Guardiola for the Grand Cru and for Premier Crus, the specifications like later on.
Yes. Well, on the Grand Crus, there's only 2, San Lorenzo and Calderara. And actually there's another one, but it's a tiny little monopole. I do about 1,200 bottles, which is a little island inside the last island, the last cultivated island inside a lava flow of 1982. So it's the only island that survived. And we have half a hectare there. And we make about, between 1,200 and 1,600 bottles, depending on the vintage. But there is something that I found out later, after having decided that those were the wines that deserved a higher level of recognition, and with a friend of mine who's a geologist. We studied the area, and those two areas on the north side of the Etna are the only two areas whose soil hasn't changed in 70,000 years. In other words, they belong to an era called the elliptical era of the volcano. And since then, in the thousands of lava flows that have occurred, last night I was driving back home and there was a lava flow. You could see it running down the volcano in rivers. In these thousands of years of lava flows, almost the entire volcano has been recovered by subsequent lava flows. But there's some little pockets that have never been covered. And most of them are at high altitudes, too high to plant the vineyards, or too low. But some of them survived, both on the south side and the north side, and a few on the east side as well. And these two, Calderara and San Lorenzo, have actually these old soils, these very old soils. So it may be that the quality is linked to that, but on the other hand, these two soils are completely different. So who knows? It's difficult to assess, but what's also interesting is that here the geology is very young because the volcano is only 800,000 years old. And the geology of the soils is very different from a normal geological division, such as in Piedmont or in Burgundy, because there you have actual parcels that can be delineated perfectly. Now, I've delineated the same thing. I've put borders on the contrade and delineated an area, okay? But because of lava flows, what happens is that the geology of an area that's contained in a square or whatever it's contained in, as the lava comes down, not only in waves, but also in rivers, like this, and different lava flows will have interconnecting rivers, like this and that. Not all, for instance, of Calderara is worthy to be a Grand Cru, or not all of Santo Spirito, right? And so, because not all, in the middle of these, you have spots where in some cases you can't even make an Etna Rosso, you just make a rosé, for instance, because the soils are not in one single area, in the case of Etna, are not all the same. You have small little areas which are not really as fine as they could be. So in many ways, it's up to the producer himself, it's up to the estate himself, to the honesty of the estate, to be able to choose, and not only the honesty, but the know-how of the estate to recognize what are the areas that are very fine and deserve the name of a cru, and to remove the areas that are not good enough, or the grapes from the areas that are not good enough, and put them in an Etna Rosso, for instance, or in extreme cases to produce a rosé from that. So it's actually quite complex and interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it is.
So the thing about Etna is that it is characterized by this very unique volcanic terroir, complex reality, but also it is characterized, just like Burgundy and just like Barolo and Barbaresco, by specific grapes. you really can't talk about Burgundy without thinking of Pinot Noir. Granted, there's also Chardonnay for the whites, even Aligoté. In Barolo, if you talk about Barolo, then it really has to be Nebbiolo. And on Etna, you have some dominant grape varieties, Carricante, mainly for the whites, although there are many other white grapes growing on Etna, and the two Nerellos, Cappuccio and Mascalese for the reds. And you make both Etna Bianco and Etna Rosso. You also make an Etna Rosato wine. But tell us a little bit about the Etna Bianco. You make a bunch of different Etna Biancos. We have the Calderara Sottana Etna Bianco with us today. But tell us a little bit about the magic of Etna Bianco before we talk about Etna Rosso.
Okay. Well, yes, I make 5 Etna Biancos. An Etna Bianco tout court, like an entry-level Etna Bianco village, let's say, and 4 different single vineyards from the 3 different sides of the Etna. And so Carricante, for instance, almost all the producers on Etna have much less experience of Carricante than they have of Nerello Mascalese, excepting Milo, which is the town where you only make whites. So, but in general, for instance, on the north side, and this is common of most of Europe, where we have our vineyards, most of our vineyards, on the north side was dedicated to red wine because it was, historically known for the best area for reds. And in all of Europe, wine is basically red. And so where you make great reds, you don't make whites. As soon as the reds get a little less great, you get some whites, and then you get more and more whites as the reds get, water, more and more water until you make only whites. So we never had reds on the north side, except for the white grapes, Carricante mostly, but also some Catarratto and Minella and Grecanico and Insolia that were planted with the red grapes, a small percentage of whites, like it used to be in Tuscany and like it used to be in Burgundy as well, where, with Aligoté and Pinot Gris and Pinot Meunier and stuff like that were planted with the Pinot Noirs, just to make it a little lighter, not quite as powerful as tannic, because the farmers like to drink the wines young. So my first whites in 2005 was made by a field blend of all the whites that I could find in my old red grape vineyards. That's when I made my first white. And today still I respect that field blend with my Etna Bianco. So that was about 70% or 75% Carricante, and that it had all these other little grapes that were planted. And that's how I made my first white, because there was no white planted on the north side. Then eventually, in 2007, I planted my first white. And in 2014, I made my first Calderara white. And then I made Santo Spirito also in 14, and then added, the wine of Milo and a crew from the south side called Montalto. So that's what we have now. We have these 4 different single vineyards, and those are mostly Carricante, 99% Carricante. There may be a little bit here of something else here and there, but that's basically it. And that is the white grape of Etna. But we have, because at least I have, much less experience, much less, 7 years or less experience than I have with the reds. Therefore, what does that mean? We don't know exactly where to plant on the north side. We know where to plant reds, but do we know where to plant whites? That's a different business. So with the whites, we have a lot to learn still. I mean, I'm very proud of the whites that I make, but I'm sure that I can make whites better in time. And in fact, this year, for the first time, 2022, I harvested a Calderara Sottana vineyard for the first time that I know in my heart of hearts will improve the Calderara. because of the quality of the soil and surrounded by a wood. It's the highest vineyard in all of Calderara. So the cool climate there will give a more vertical effect to the Calderara, which tends to be, how should I say it, rather Baroque in a way, you know? So this will give it a bit more of an uplift. It will make it more of a dancer. So that's part of the learning process, where to plant, how to plant, and what will that give, you know? And where will the best whites come from? Who knows, you know? But it's wonderful to try. Next year, we'll have the first full harvest in Milo of our own wine, of our own grapes from the vineyard that we planted. So that's going to be fabulous. I mean, this year we had only 20 hectoliters made, less 15 hectoliters of Milo, but 3-year-old vines, you know, but that gives you a message. It's the first vintage, you learn something there, and the next year you try to do something better. So I think Caricante and Etna Bianco will improve in the next 10 years immensely. And as good as some of the wines are today, I think we will know so much more about them very soon that they will rival the reds in many ways. With the reds, let's say, at least as far as I'm concerned, we already know quite a bit, at least as far as Terre Nere. We vinify every year 50 different vats of Etna Rosso every year. So if you do it for 20 years, you've done 1,000 vinifications.
Yeah.
And so that's given me enough knowledge to know where to buy grapes, where to, you know, buy vineyards if I can. And in fact, one of the things that differentiates Terre Nere from all other estates is the outstanding quality of all its vineyards.
Mm-hmm.
All our vineyards are top. And, you know, there's no secret, there's no, you know, from the very beginning, you know, I told myself, you have to start with, you know, Premier Cru, Grand Cru vineyards. It may not be today or tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, but eventually you'll make great wines. Mm-hmm. But if you start with a village, you'll make a very fine village, but you'll never make, you know, you'll never be able to make a cru. So all our vineyards, absolutely every single one of them. And it, you know, it creates logistical problems, it creates all kinds of problems. But we have 29 parcels. It drives us absolutely crazy, right? Yeah, but, you know, we've privileged that over anything else because the quality of the vineyard is fundamental.
So that's important, and I will let Echo translate, but just to add to what Mark was saying for the benefit of those listening, first of all, Terre Nere, being one of the pioneers on Etna, had the advantage of being able to buy land when it was cheaper and it was more available. Back in 2000, it seems crazy to tell you today, but I can guarantee you because I was there. In 2000, virtually nobody in Italy knew anything about Caricante and Nerello Mascalese, and I mean even very famous Italian wine journalists. I remember very well in 2000 at a wine tasting with a famous Sicilian winemaker who brought these wines from Etna, and nobody in the room knew anything about them. So back then, you were able to buy the best vineyards. Today, Etna is becoming super popular, and there's hundreds of wineries now making Etna wines, but clearly a lot of the best plots have been bought, and what is left is very small plots that not everybody wants to farm. As Mark was saying, to have to farm 29 different parcels is a big headache, and a lot of people just don't want to do that. So what that means is they go looking for areas that are maybe larger and where more vineyard land can be bought, so it can be worked all in the same area. It makes life a lot easier, but those are not necessarily the best sites. So that's something to keep in mind. the up and coming newer estates, even though they are owned and manned by very talented, very passionate people, they just don't have the super high quality of vineyards because those vineyards just aren't really available anymore. And that is something that Terre Nere has certainly an advantage of, and it's to their credit. And I think it's only fair to say that. The other thing that's important, I think many people who are listening to this know, but Mark was talking about Milo. Milo is a city like Beaune, if you will. Remember that the Etna production zone is an inverted C. There is a northern, an eastern, and a southern side. The northern side is where you make all the best red wines. The eastern side is where you make historically the best white wines. The southern side, a bit of both. Milo is the town on the eastern side that historically has been always associated with the finest Carricante, just like the towns of Randazzo and Castiglione, Linguaglossa in the northern slope of Etna have always been associated with the best Etna Rosso wines. Now, as we learn more about Etna, some of the things we believe are true may change somewhat, but for now, that is what we know and what we believe is right.
对，那么我们先来聊一聊 Anna 当中的白，就是 Anna Bianco。那么刚刚伊恩有跟我们非常详细的 map out 了这个脑子当中的地图啊，因为就是在 Anna 这一座活火山上面呢，如果你要找好的红或者好的白的话，应该怎么找呢？就是你先把 Anna 定位一下南边北边，然后还有东边。那么在火山的南部呢是出产两者都有，那么在北边呢是非常好的红 Anna 的红，然后呢在Anna 的西边呢它是比较出名的就是 Anna 的白了。那么我们刚刚 Marco 和 Ian 提到的 Milo 呢就位于我们的西边 Anna 这座活火山的西边。所以其实 Anna 这一个宝藏地区啊，刚才 Marco 还跟我们聊到了，因为正是因为它是一座活火山，所以呢，你经常可以看到火山喷发的景象。其实早在不久前，我们还有看到这个新闻上面说Anna 的火山爆发。那么在火山爆发的时候呢，你会看到一个非常有趣的现象，就是它的熔岩岩浆呢会慢慢的流过来，那么这个产生的这样的一个现象就会导致什么事情呢？就是它的岩浆会把所有的这些土地啊全部覆盖一层岩浆，那么只有很少的一部分土地它没有被岩浆流过，那这些没有被流过的幸存的地方呢，你就会发现它的这个土壤是有着非常非常悠久的历史。那这些土壤啊，我们再去把它种出来的那些葡萄藤当中Marco 刚刚就有跟我们讲到了，它其实有一些岩浆是呈河流状的，有一些呢是它就是比较零星的像这个小溪一样流过了，那么所以它的地质会非常非常的不同。甚至于隔一小段距离，它就会有很大的这种土壤的不同的层状啊。然后呢，然后我们再来看一下刚才我们有提到的，这个葡萄品种就是 Garigante。在红的呢，我们知道有 Nerello Mascalese 和 Nerello Cappuccio， 那么白的呢就是 Carigante 这种葡萄品种了。那么 Carigante 这种葡萄品种呢，它在这个Milo 这个小镇上呢，它是特别发挥的表现的特别好的。那么除此以外呢，第一个年份就是我们 Terre Nere 酿的白的话呢，它当时是在这个Anna 火山的最北部。那么大家知道最北部的这块地方其实是以红最有名最出名， 那么所以其实 Marco 当时也不是很确定说，哎，这块在北部的这块土地是不是可以酿出令人惊艳的白呢？所以一切只能靠当时的这个感觉直觉来走。那么当时第一个年份呢，就是用了70%到75%的 Garigante 来酿的第一个年份的白。然后呢，当然因为第一个年份是07年啊，所以对比酒庄的红的话呢，其实 Marco 他刚刚坦言说，就是少了7年的这个经验啊，所以可能说，当时还是会有一些不确定的因素存在。所以一直到现在，他还是对于白有着非常大的期望，因为他相信，其实在不断的探索过程当中，不断的去研究怎么可以种植好，然后哪一片土地可以种植得更好，包括他的这个对于葡萄藤的了解越来越深入，对于它的酿造越来越深入之后，我们可以酿出更加惊艳的白来。然后呢，我们刚才 Marco 还打了一个非常精妙的比喻，就是我们一共已经有了每20年的红的这个酿造经验，那么每一年都有差不多50个不同的小地块的红，那么乘一乘的话，我们就可以得出一个惊人的数字，那就是有1000种不同的红的这个cuvée。那么如果这个1000种不同的 cuvée 来说，这个数字是非常惊人的。那么如果我们把这种酿造理念和酿造哲学再换算到白的身上的话，其实我们还有非常大的潜力可以去酿造出这个非常好的白来啊。所以我们也是非常非常期待我们酒庄的更多优秀的作品。
So, Mark, tell us a little bit about the white Calderara Sottana. How are the various Etna Bianco wines you make? How are they different, and what's specific? Because then we have the Calderara Sottana red as well. So you don't make whites and reds from most of your vineyards, but you do from Calderara Sottana. So what's special about Calderara Sottana, and what is the characteristic of this Etna Bianco compared to your others?
Well, okay. I also make a Santo Spirito white and Santo Spirito red.
Yeah.
And but I don't do anything else. Before saying this, I wanted to complete what you were saying about Milo.
Yeah.
Milo is an very interesting town, and it's a perfect example of how different things are on Etna. It's practically in the middle of the sea, of the inverted sea that you mentioned, which is the Appellation. It's 45 minutes from where I am, drive, 45 minutes, which is like in Burgundy would be like from Volnay to Gevry or something like that. But in Milo, statistically, it rains twice as much as it rains here.
Yeah.
Twice as much.
Yeah.
So, and it's a much cooler climate. The sun rises there, and pretty soon it goes on the backside, on the west side of the volcano. And so it only gets really the morning and the early afternoon sun. So it's very cool. It's very humid because it's on the sea. And so it gets the sea winds that come in. So the climate there is, and also it's the only area of the Etna whose soils have never changed, because they actually come from a crash of the volcano who crashed down and covered the whole eastern part of Milo, the eastern part of the volcano where Milo is. And so they're very peculiar to that area. And they don't drain, which is completely different from every other place. To compound that, it's very steep, and it has gullets, like, you know, and in the gullets you have woods coming in, bringing more and more humidity. So it's a very difficult place to make wine, and it's impossible to make red wine there. I mean, red wine worth, you know, the rest of the Etna. You can make good rosé there. So, and the appellation, which was statutes which were written in '68, were actually written by a producer in Milo, and which they were very well written, by the way. And among the other things that he said, he awarded to Milo the only place where you can make Etna Bianco Superiore,
Right.
right, which is supposed to be the higher level of white. But really, I think what really has happened is by a natural selection, that place could only make white wine. It could never really make very fine red wine. So that is kind of follows up on what I said before, you know, where you make reds, you don't plant whites.
Yeah.
There, everybody planted white because that was the wine that really, you know, gave people satisfaction. Had a very cool climate, very fresh, and Caricante suffers from oidium, of course, and suffers very much in Milo from that. But otherwise, it's quite resistant. It's not quite as tight a cluster, so it doesn't rot. It doesn't suffer from rot as much as Nerello Mascalese and so on. So it developed naturally as the haven for white wine. Whether we will find areas in the south side or the north side that will be as good or better, we don't know yet.
Exactly.
That's just something that we'll have to find out. But certainly, Calderara and Santo Spirito that we make, the characteristics are completely different from Milo, completely different from the south side that we make. In Calderara, the characteristics are a certain kind of opulence, which you find in the red. But the odd thing about Calderara, whether red or white, is that if you taste, you know, we make, I think, 7 different red wines. If you taste 6 of them, they all have like a thin line through them, and you see all the differences, but you see that they belong, right? That they are siblings. Calderara, for whatever reason I can't possibly explain, really stands out. It's it doesn't mean that it's better or it's worse. But it is a world apart. It has a different color, different set of flavors and of bouquets, completely different. The white, the Caricante, is also very different. Although the Caricante is, in fact, in a distance from Santo Spirito, is very close, the soils are completely different. Calderara soils are all stone. Mm-hmm. Santo Spirito is all volcanic ash. It's almost like a black talcum powder. So they're completely different. Calderara has this wonderful kind of opulence. The white, the Calderara Bianco, has this opulence that's almost, it's like you feel like you're in Marie Antoinette's boudoir, you know, with, you know, wonderful perfumes coming out in all directions, fanning out, you know, in all directions. Whereas, and that is true of the red as well. Whereas you have crews like Guardiola, which is like a zoom lens, you know, very, very focused. Not the opposite of fanning out, is just concentrating on almost the monolithic flavors. And Calderara has this, both in the red and the white, has this, I said Baroque and I said opulent, but it has something of a richness that defines it. And with the red, what's interesting is that even when you rack the wine off the skins, when it's a week old or 10 days old, you never get floral bouquets. You get something that is already, it's born in the, it's as if it was born in the autumn that it was born in. You get autumn flavors, autumn smells. You things that you expect from a wine that's 1 or 2 years old, you get them after a week. So you get, you know, cigar box flavors, all kinds of spices. You get moss, underbrush, wood, like a wet, walking in a wet wood, you know, wet leaves. It's the only one that does that. It's the only one. Everybody else has floral qualities of all different kinds and mineral qualities of all different kinds. But Calderara is unique in that. And it comes through in every tasting we do. When we do a horizontal tasting. When we get to Calderara, all of a sudden people say, well, what's this? With the white, it is completely different from the other whites as well. And the thing that it has in common with the red is this horizontal characteristic of all its bouquets and its flavors.
Is that also is it also partly due maybe to a slightly warmer microclimate? Calderara means warm area historically. Do you find that or not really?
No, because for instance, we have Feudo di Mezzo, which is warmer than Calderara, and it's the first one to be harvested every year. And then there's the high part of Calderara, which is not nearly as warm as the lower part of Calderara. I don't know. As I said, I really, you're right. Calderara means warm. Means caldera means something, and it probably is true because it's, among other things, because it's so rocky. It's so rocky that you can't see the soil for the rocks in many of the rockiest parts. So you imagine, because everything is black and the rock is black, that it would keep the day heat and give it back at night.
Right.
So, but at the same time, it has a freshness that rivals all the other ones. So it doesn't make really any sense. I think what characterizes Calderara more than anything else is the soil. And for some reason, this very hard soil, is all rocks. It's as if it filters something and delivers something very, very, very fine. It is by far, with respect to all other wines that we make, it's by far the one with the finest tannins. Yes.
I remember in the early days, you used to tell me that you felt it was also the most Burgundian of your Etna Rossos. Do you still think that, or have you changed your mind over the years?
Well, I think that what's happened over the years is that for reasons of improving also our cellars, because we did this little by little, as whenever I had a little bit of money, I bought things. And also understanding the vineyards more and more. I think what has happened is that all the wines now have an identity that's wonderful, and that is, year after year, you can identify them extremely clearly. So what has happened is that now you can point to something like, let's say, Moganazzi, and immediately find an analogy in Burgundy and say, okay, this is more like a Pommard. The tannins are a little bit rougher, a little bit more rustic in that sense. You go in that direction, but the wine is very full. It has the same kind of grip, and so on and so forth. And Santo Spirito is more Chambol-like, more delicate and floral, and this. So they all begin now more and more to have brothers that you can identify either in Piedmont or in Burgundy. So, but for instance, if I were to say where Calderara would where the analogy in Burgundy would find Calderara, it would be in Von Romane, because Von Romanes tend to have a dark heart. And the same thing, that there's a darkness about the Calderara, is an autumn kind of crepuscular feeling about it that I find in Von Romane's wines. They don't have the brilliant, the solar luminous quality that Gevrey has, right? For instance, or other, wonderful character. Well, Feudo di Mezzo is a perfect Volnay, for instance. It has the same kind of perfection when it's very young, the same suppleness, not quite the exciting, bouquet of a Cotonui, but very deep and very composed, always beautiful, ages beautifully. So you get these analogies, of course. Some of them more towards Burgundy, some of them more towards Piedmont, interestingly.
Which Barolo vineyard would you say Calderara Sottana reminds you of?
That's more difficult. Calderara, I never thought of that, really. Calderara Sottana, which vineyard? Let me think.
Well, you don't have to if you're not ready. It's like a work in progress. We'll do this again in 5 years, and then we'll talk in terms of Barolo.
It's interesting because there's a vineyard that I think comes close to it.
Okay.
Which is in between, actually belongs to 2 different townships.
Okay.
It's a vineyard that's mostly in La Morra, but partially also in the Barolo township. Brunate, exactly.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Brunate has a freshness to it, which Calderara has, but has a depth and a dark side to it as well. Which, for instance, Canubi doesn't. Canubi has all this, wonderful, flowery, beautiful thing. There's nothing dark about it at all. But Brunate has that, has a dark side to it. Yeah. And at the same time, it has a fragrance and a freshness and an uplift.
Wonderful.
So maybe that's the kind of vineyard that it would remind me of. Doesn't have the tannins of either Monforte or Casilone Falletto, but it has, Brunate is strange. You don't feel like it really belongs to La Morra. It belongs more to the Barolo side,
Sure.
That I don't know why that is, but Santo Spirito again would be more like Rocca dell'Annunziata, for instance.
Sure.
It has that wonderful femininity about it that I like very much.
Cool. We'll let Echo translate it before she forgets everything. For
Oh, sorry.
I was like so drawn into this, and for Catarata and San Spirito, I actually have a few questions as well.
Okay.
So I think I better translate, or I better just ask.
Okay, then ask me the question. First you translate, then the questions.
Yeah. Okay. 那么我们刚才一段非常非常精彩的对谈啊，因为这段对谈呢，就是在解释 Catarata 和 San Spirito 这个2块不同的风土它们的表现。因为 Catarata 呢，一共Terre Nere 一共有7个不同的单一园。那么这个7个不同的单一园，它当然有一个非常好的一个共性，就是它们就是非常线性，然后非常轻盈的这样一个共性。那么如果我们把 Catarata 拆开来看的话，首先呢，它的土壤结构非常的神奇，因为它是非常 rocky， 就是非常stony， 就很多的石头。然后呢，这些石头它其实是可以起到一个吸热的作用。那么 Catarata 这个意思，它的意思是热的意思，就是它有一点炎热，在意大利语里面。那么它其实这个黑色的石头啊，可以起到一种吸热的作用。那么到夜晚呢，它可以释放出热量。所以在Catarata 这一块土地里面呢，它其实相对来说葡萄是更容易成熟的。那么我们说到这一块这一些单一园当中的酒的风格品质来说，你会发现第一这个酒液它是非常非常的轻盈剔透的，就可以用 opulence 来形容。那么第二个呢是当你去喝它的时候，你会发现它不像有一些你所熟知的一下子就会有非常非常多的花香的这种果香，但是呢实际上你会闻到一些比方说像cigar box spices， 然后 underbrush wet leaves， 就是这些湿树叶啊，然后有一些像雪茄盒啊，甚至一些香料新草料，还有一些像这个干树叶的味道。那么这些味道呢，实际上很多时候是你要在酒可能是陈年1到2年之后才会慢慢发展出来的味道。但是 Catarata 就有这样一个神奇的魔力，就是它可以在刚刚酒去做这个倒灌的时候，它就已经发展出这种神奇的味道来了。所以可以想象这一块黑土地赋予它的神奇的魔力啊。那么另外一个呢，就是我们刚才Marco 用了一个勃艮第的一块地来跟它做一个平行对比。那么这块是哪一块勃艮第的地呢？就是 Vaux Romanée。那么 Vaux Romanée 它有着因为它 既有这种在酒液当中的这种丰盈的质感，但是同时呢，它又有非常柔美，它又有非常力量感的那一部分。那么刚才伊恩又问了一个问题，就是如果说把巴罗洛的一块地来去做平行对比的话，Marco 会想到哪一块地呢？那么刚才差点难倒了 Marco， 但是呢这个问题也被迎刃而解了，就是Marco 想了一下回答说呢，就是 Brunati 这块地因为 Brunati 呢同时它是非常的果味轻盈的，那么同时它也有一个我们可以用 dark side 就是有一点小心机，并且呢可能是会有一些像绅士一样的这种感觉，它并不是一味的清新，一味的这种果味，而是它有这种像雪茄盒甚至于有一些湿树叶，有一些非常深沉非常内敛的部分在它的内核当中，所以是非常值得探索，以及呢它也是有它自己非常独特的深邃的一面的。那么这个就是我们刚刚说的Terroir这一块非常神秘又非常深邃的单因缘。那么另外 Santo Spirito 的这个它呢更多的是 Black Ash， 就是黑色的石灰的这个lava 这一些呢我们说如果跟我们做一个平行比对的话，因为它更多的有着更多的花香，有着更多的这种柔美和轻盈的个性，所以呢我们把它更多的比作山柏这种非常具有花香又非常轻盈的这样一个勃艮第的一块土地。So那么这个也是这个两块地的不同之处。So just now I have a question regarding so like we are talking about the different soils, and what are the other probably elements or microclimates that could influence these two different places or their wine styles. Let's say one is more opulent, but then it has a dark side of the wine, which makes you think of a more gentleman, I would say, character. Then the other one is like more fragrant and more floral. What are the microclimate or any elements that you can think of that?
So I guess the question is, what would you say are the most important factors in determining the organoleptic profiles and the mouthfeel of Etna Rosso and white wines? The soil for sure. What else? That's probably your number one factor. Any other factors important, or is it really mostly the soil?
No, there's, well, as I mentioned about Milo, the microclimate is, that's the extreme example of a microclimate difference, right? Mm-hmm. So, for instance, if you go on the south side, particularly with the whites, you have to, because it has a southern exposure, you have to go higher up in altitude to get the fragrance and the freshness. So our white wine vineyard is aptly called Montalto because that's what the area is, and it's at 950 meters altitude, right? Which is basically would be on the north side the equivalent of 750 or 800 meters, right? So the one other quite extraordinary characteristic of the appellation on Etna is that you can make wines from the altitudes of 400 meters all the way to 1,000 meters. So now 600 meters in altitude is huge. No other appellation in the world, has that kind of, the distance from low to high. I mean, 50 meters makes a difference.
Sure.
Here and anywhere else, right? So, whether you're in the Chianti or whether you're, anywhere. So Ave or in Italy, any Appalachian 50 meters or 100 meters is huge difference, right? So here you have 600 meters of possibilities, and that is an enormous difference. In Milo, for instance, to go back to Milo, anything that's below 550 meters no longer tastes like Milo because it doesn't have that high-strung, Milo effect. Because you go up 150 meters and or 200 meters, and you have that that pointed acidic kind of drive, vertical drive of the wines there. If you go too high up above 850 meters, then it's very, very difficult to make good wine, fine wine every year because you don't have enough heat. You don't have it's too cold. So on the north side, for instance, that is also very important. Below 600 meters, the wines tend to be heavy. They tend to be heavy, alcoholic, and not much fun. It's better, in fact, to go high than to go low on Etna, for sure. Mm-hmm. And so, between 600 and 800 would be, generally speaking, the ideal altitudes. But you can get very fine wines above and slightly below, I imagine. But I've usually gone within those differences, and there it's already 200 meters is quite a big difference, So in Calderara you go from 600 meters to 750 meters altitude, and there you can see the differences immediately, and even color differences. Yeah, it's quite surprising. So no question that the altitude on which the coolness and the temperature excursion between day and night becomes even more extreme as you go up the volcano. Is a determining factor in the type of wine and the quality of wine, and so that blended with the with the soil differences, in infinite types of variations, is the makeup of all these wonderful different wines. To give you an idea, Guardiola, which is our highest vineyard, is the one that I always harvest last. Okay, but the characteristics of Guardiola, the ripening, let's say, characteristics of Guardiola are very similar to the ones of San Lorenzo. Why? San Lorenzo is, let's say, 800 meters. Guardiola goes from 800 to 900 meters, 900 and some meters. But whereas the soils of Guardiola are very, 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 very poor. They are basically volcanic sand and basaltic pebbles. So it's extremely poor soil. The soils of San Lorenzo are quite rich. But because San Lorenzo is almost the last vineyards on the northwest side, the climate is cooler. So 800 meters in San Lorenzo is equivalent to 800 and 900 meters in Guardiola, the cool climate. So just before we harvest Guardiola, or basically almost at the same time, we harvest the highest vineyards of San Lorenzo that we have. But the wines are completely different because of the soil. So the climate is the same or similar, but although it's a little rainier in the San Lorenzo, but the soils are completely different. So San Lorenzo is much more massive. It has a fleshy kind of thing. It's not muscular, but has a lot of flesh and the sinew behind the flesh. Guardiola has the sinew, but not the flesh. And it works more on a finesse of bouquet than anything else.
We'll let Echo. That's very interesting. So we'll let her translate that part.
Sure. 因为我们刚刚其实从头开始讲起的话呢，我们补充一下，就是刚才我们聊到这个 Milo 这个镇，因为 Milo 这个镇呢。它一方面是因为它的降雨非常多，然后另外一方面呢，因为它离这个海面非常近，然后呢，它的这个海风啊吹过来也会对它有非常多的冷凉的影响，所以呢，历史的选择就 决定了其实这个镇真正只剩下了就是它酿白是非常非常的出色，而红的葡萄呢在这个镇当中它其实是很难以完全成熟的，所以这也是造就了自然的选择和历史的选择，造就了这个镇当中非常非常的以这个白葡萄为著名。那么我们就是以这个例子啊，然后延伸我们来看一下刚才我们的这个问题，就是在我们刚刚无论是说到了 Terroir 还是说到了这个 San Spirito 这个不同的风土，它们一个呢是土壤的原因，另外一个呢就是它的海拔的原因。我们可以来看一下海拔在这个当中呢起的一个非常关键性的作用。刚才 Marco 跟我们分享了，在西西里啊，海拔可以从400米到1000米不等。那么其实呢，这个在世界上都是非常罕见的，就是你既能找到海拔400米的不同的这个葡萄园，另外呢，你也可以找到海拔比它高1000米以上的这个葡萄园，它同时都是在酿造着质量还不错的葡萄酒。但是呢，这个它们的风格相差是巨大的，因为在海拔低于600米，在西西里这个位置上面呢，你会发现这个酒的风格它会非常的沉重，而且呢，它的酒精度会非常的高，你就喝得出它这种在口腔当中的灼烧感，其实并不是特别愉悦。所以呢，在西西里这块风土宝地上面呢，大家都是往海拔高的方向走。差不多在海拔600米以上就可以酿造出非常棒的质量非常好的这些酒款。那么像我们刚刚说到的一个特级园就是 Guardiola 这一块Ian 本身也非常喜欢的这一块特级园呢，它就是通常是在所有的单一园当中采收的时间是最晚的。那为什么是最晚呢？因为第一是有2个原因，第一个呢是Guardiola 它的海拔是在800米到970米左右，然后它的土壤呢都是火山岩土壤，然后有很多的这种 pebbles， 就是这个鹅卵石在里面。那么这个鹅卵石其实它也是会有一些这个散热的作用吸热的作用。然后呢，另外就是我们的 San Lorenzo 这块单一园。那么这块单一园呢，它相反，它的土壤结构它是更加肥沃一些。然后这个土壤结构肥沃的土壤结构酿造出来的酒体的风格呢，它是有更多的咀嚼感、肉质感，就是你会觉得这个酒喝进去是胖乎乎的这种感觉，不是那种精瘦的感觉。然后呢，但 San Lorenzo 的它的海拔呢是在800米左右。但刚才说到一个非常有趣的现象，就是它所在的这个海拔800米实际上呢，它可以跟 Guardiola 的900米左右的海拔可以相提并论。为什么这么说呢？因为它所在的这个微气候、微风土其实它可以差不多就是在 Guardiola 的比它海拔这个虽然说更低，但是呢，它们的成熟时间其实是更差不多。因为它的土壤结构然后以及当地的这个风土的微气候条件所致。这个也是我们刚刚提到的这个2块不同的单一园。Is he lost the connection?
Oh, we can't see you right now, Mark. Can you hear us? Mark?
Lost?
Oh, he lost his connection. Maybe he'll come back.
We can wait for him for a while.
But wait, in the meantime, we'll just keep yapping.
Yeah.
So the main thing is, I think that I repeat what I said earlier, because in Italian wine, there are no classifications to help wine consumers, wine lovers, even wine professionals make up their mind on which are the best wines. It's easy with Burgundy because you know that Musigny is a Grand Cru, and you know that Charme Chambertin, Chapelle Chambertin, Griotte Chambertin are all Grand Crus. You know that other vineyards are Premier Crus and others are Lieu dit. So you have an idea of what the best vineyards are and therefore why some wines are so expensive and sought after. Same thing with Bordeaux. If you're a Premier Cru Classé like Margaux or Haut-Brion, you're going to be more expensive than a fifth growth, even a very good wine like Lange-Bage, but clearly it's a different level of quality. In Italian wine, you really don't have that. So as I said earlier, Etna, for example, is now very hot. Everybody's making Etna wines. And people tend to say, oh, they're all the same level and they're all, but that's not true. That's just not true. There are some very talented Etna winemakers, but the quality of grapes they have in vineyards is not that high. So you can be the most talented winemaker in the world, but if you're working with grapes from Santenay or Marsanne, you're never going to be able to make a wine as good from Musigny or Chambertin Claude Besse. That's just the reality of the situation. But in Italy, because there aren't any classifications and nobody wants them for this very reason, then people say, oh, this is a very good producer, so the wine is great. Yeah, but that's not really true. And that's something that is true of Brunello, it's true of Barolo, and it's true of every other Italian wine denomination. So what wine lovers and wine collectors and sommeliers have to do is they really have to make an effort to learn who has the best vineyards where. And it's not easy because they don't tell you that information. Clearly, somebody who's got a low-level, low-quality vineyard, he's never going to tell you, oh, mine's lousy. So you really need to listen to other people, read, and ask around, and of course, to taste a lot of wines, because invariably it becomes apparent which the best wines are. And for example, with Terre Nere, it's really very obvious. As good as all these wines are, Guardiola and Calderara Sottana really are always the best wines. I know Mark really loves Santo Spirito. He considers it to be even better than Guardiola. But I'm a huge, huge fan of Guardiola. Over 20 years that I've been tasting these wines, Guardiola is always, always one of the best. The one thing that's lovely about Santo Spirito, and also another cru that Terre Nere makes called Feudo di Mezzo, is that the Feudo di Mezzo cru and the Santo Spirito cru give you fleshier wines, rounder wines, softer wines. And that really has a lot of appeal, and people really love these wines. Feudo di Mezzo is really hard not to like because it's so yummy and juicy and round. But when you drink these wines enough, you realize that as good as it is, Guardiola and Calderara Sottana, which are more vertical wines and therefore not as pleasant when they're young, invariably are much more complex and deeper. And that is the difference between a Musigny and a Chambol Musigny Premier Cru. They're all great wines. I mean, I love Chambol Musigny Les Amoureuses wines. It's a Premier Cru, but it's basically a Grand Cru. So what's there not to like? But it's not always so close in quality many times. So for example, you know, the southern part of Etna is a good area, but it's nowhere as good as the northern part of Etna for the red wines. The fact is, a lot of estates now have to go buy on the south side because they can't afford to buy on the north side, or there just isn't that much land for sale anymore on the north side. It doesn't mean that the south side can't give you great red Etna wines. Of course it can, but there are fewer truly great sites on the southern side compared to the northern side. And that's something that you just have to know, because if not, you end up believing what everybody tells you, and that's not usually a good thing.
And Ian, I know that you really, really like Guardiola, because I noticed that you get it a very high score.
Yeah.
So could you let us know what actually attracts you in this wine?
I hope that Mark comes back, because I'd love to hear him talk about it, because he isn't as convinced by Guardiola as I am. He thinks of Guardiola as a very good Premier Cru, if you will, but not a Grand Cru like Calderara Sutana and Santo Spirito.
I think he comes back.
Is he back? We don't see him yet.
No, do you see me now? We got disconnected.
Yeah, we got disconnected. That's fine. We were going to ask you, Mark, about Guardiola, which is a cru that I love. I really, really love the wines of Guardiola. But I know you tend to think of it as a very high quality Premier Cru rather than a Grand Cru. And I always wanted to ask you about that, because over the years, even drinking your wines, I just find the Guardiola is always so complex and so vertical and so beautiful. But I know you think a little less highly of it. I just wanted to know why, so maybe I can understand.
Look, there are people like you that swear by Guardiola, and
there we go.
There's a lot of them.
So I'm not drunk. So
yes,
I'm not drunk.
No. I mean, there's a lot of people that have asked me the same question, and I mean, I don't have, you know, a tenth of the wine that I would need to supply the demand. And I love Guardiola. I do very, very much. But I don't, although, I mean, let's say that after San Lorenzo and Calderara and Boca d'Orzo, which I don't know if you're probably
the little one.
With. Yeah, we made so little,
yeah,
hardly anybody gets any of it. But definitely Guardiola comes very close to those. I just feel that in time, in fact, oddly enough, I'll tell you something else. The first 4 or 5 vintages, at least until 2009 or 10, I found it a bit difficult when it was young. And then something happened, which I think was a complex of understanding of how to work the vineyard specifically, that made it much more beautiful even when it was young. And I think we found somehow the connection, and it's very, very lovely and beautiful now, even when very young. But it doesn't have, I think, the consistency in quality that Calderara and San Lorenzo have.
Yeah.
Although character-wise, and you see, the thing is, as I see it, in wine, character is, as in human beings, of course, is extremely important, right? Yeah. So you may have somebody that has a very interesting character, but that is not exactly what the doctor ordered. He may be lopsided and this and that, but very, very interesting. Same thing is true of literature. Somebody that's a character that's all very good and also good. You tend to want to see something kind of naughty in him to get an interest there. And the same thing with wines. So, for instance, Ferro di Mezzo is one of those wines that's born perfect. He's like the good kid of the class. He's so good, he's so generous, so perfect, so everything is in balance, that you find him in a sense not boring, but you kind of say, well, you'd like to have something awkward there to stimulate you more. It ages beautifully, it's wonderful, but it doesn't get sometimes it doesn't get the gratification that it should deserve. Guardiola is on the opposite side. It's exciting, and it has a wonderful, wonderful, precise character that's always interesting, always, asks you questions as you drink it. It keeps asking you, and it keeps stimulating you to drink more and to taste and to understand and this and that. So I find it wonderful, and a lot of people do, and I think that it's very close. It's like a premier cru. It's like Les Amoureuses. It's next to Musigny, but it's not Musigny. Or Les Souchons, right?
Exactly.
It's like it's like a Clos Saint-Jacques or something like that.
That makes sense. That's cool. That's great.
我们刚刚因为Ian问了一个我也非常想问的问题，就是Guardiola 这一款酒啊，虽然它其实是1级园，或者是说Marco 一直把它定义为超1级园，但是他一直没有给它特级园，那是为什么？它好像是一个没有那么被受宠的一个小孩，在庄主眼里。那么我们因为也喝过蛮多不同的年份，那么最终就想听一听 Marco 是怎么看待这一个单一园的，就是 Guardiola。那么首先他回答这个问题 Guardiola 呢，他确实是非常出色，而且他是非常非常的有故事的这样一款酒，但是唯独呢 Marco 觉得它的持续性并没有那么好。那么他做了一个文学上的比喻啊，就好像是一个主角或者是一个主人公，他虽然是那么的富有魅力啊，然后呢他的口才啊各方面，他的性格也是非常的好，而且他会让人有一种心生喜爱的感觉。但是呢，他同时他又会做出一些让你不那么有时候有一些有被他感觉 catch 到，好像没有你心目中的这个一直如此的perfect 的这样一个存在啊，所以呢，他就会觉得说，其实固然他非常非常的棒啊，但是他还是没有达到他心目中的这样一个完美的存在。那么相对比像 San Lorenzo 他的这个存在呢，就是一个非常非常完美的人设了，他就已经可以到达一个特级园的水准了，因为他的水准呢每年的出产都非常的好，而且他从来没有令庄主失望过。所以我觉得这个如果用文学或者是甚至于把它比作是人呢，我觉得都是其实是相通的。这是一种你也可以把它说成是处世的哲学，甚至于说是一种做人的道理，或者是世上的一个相通的道理。就是很多时候其实最难的可能就是难在坚持，并不是说偶尔一时或者是一刻当中你有多么的interesting 也有多么的有趣，但是实际上最难的是你可以一直保持这一种非常非常坚稳的坚实的这种甚至于坚定坚如磐石的这种决心吧，然后非常的稳重，非常的稳如泰山，然后你可以给大家一种非常温暖非常伟大的这种感觉在所以我觉得Marco 真的解释得非常好，我也非常喜欢他的这个解释。那么我来看一下有没有其他的问题。如果大家对庄主有任何问题的话呢，也欢迎把你们的问题打在公屏上面。也谢谢王国兴 Gary 送出的爱心。Yeah, so shall we go to the other wines like before we wrap it up? And we talk about Etna Bianco and also Guardiola, and actually we almost
Santo Spirito,
maybe.
And Santo Spirito you said a little bit about, but just tell us a little bit more about the Santo Spirito vineyard.
I have 3 parcels in Santo Spirito. 2 and the ones that contribute mostly to the Santo Spirito blend are from the lower part of Santo Spirito. They tend to have more concentration and more complexity. And then I skip the middle part. My other parcel, the largest one, by the way, is very high, and it touches the Guardiola. So there, we don't have the concentration, but we have very beautiful floral bouquets. So you have a lighter mouthfeel, but beautiful, beautiful aromatics. So let's say it's 2/3 concentration, 1/3 aromatics, as far as the composition of the vineyards go. And all the rest of the vineyards in the higher part are white. And a selection of those goes into the Santo Spirito Bianco. And so that isn't, again, an area where, because of the fairly big difference in altitudes, you can do whites and reds at the same time, and the difference in soils allows you to play with the composition of the reds, particularly. And I find that very satisfying. I love having the differences in Santo Spirito coming into a blend of something that I like very much. Again, it's interesting because it touches Guardiola. I mean, it's on the cusp of Guardiola, and as the vineyard hits with the Guardiola, the border of the Guardiola, in fact, the highest 2 plateaus that I have of Santo Spirito have Guardiola soil. So it's very, very, very interesting. There, it changes completely, and it gets that high-strung Guardiola feeling, both in the bouquet and everything. So you get that nice combination, that and some of the descriptions that people have made of the Santo Spirito are quite wonderful, and they are all have to do with the gracefulness of the wine. And all the analogies are always to its femininity. Although it has a lot of substance, it delivers that with a kind of an elegance that none of the other crews have. And interestingly enough, the first vintage was 2007, and and when it was first released, it was 2009. And in 2009, not many people still around the world knew about Etna. Yeah. And certainly, I had already 3 different single vineyards. I had Calderara and Ferro di Mezzo and Guardiola. So when I told my clients, my importers throughout the world, that I was releasing a new single vineyard, they said, please don't. This, nobody's going to want another one. Nobody's going to understand it. Where do you think you are? This and that, blah, 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 blah. But very soon it became a favorite. Sure. It's, 10 people around the table, and you put 3 or 4 of my Etnas, and 8 out of 10 will go for the Santo Spirito. Yeah. Not because it's better, but it's just so friendly, so generous, and so attractive, so charming. That's what it is. It's a charming wine. Absolutely. It has the most charm of the wines. So people, they say, oh, it's Santo Spirito is dressed to kill, or it's a sophisticated lady, or it's the Avogadro of your wines, all kinds of descriptions. Some of them are a lot of fun, but it has that kind of character. And also, Santo Spirito as an area is from the beginning, even when I bought it, even more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it was all planted. It was never abandoned. And that's a very important sign, because the last vineyards to be abandoned are the best ones, right? The ones that you can still get a little bit more money for the grapes, even if, the situation is difficult, the economy is difficult, and this and that. So generally speaking, it's the best areas that seem to survive, unless they are very, very difficult to work, like Guardiola, which is, vertical like this and all terraced and stuff like that. And that tends to be abandoned first because it costs so much, the maintenance costs so much. But and now it's becoming very, very popular. So there are other producers that are bottling Santo Spirito as well. And I think it's going to be one of the ones, because of its wonderful charm, it's going to be one of the ones that is going to be more famous than others soon.
Yeah. We'll let Echo translate because it's
Sure.
nice about the charming part, so
Yeah,
people
yeah.
know what kind of wine it is.
May I know what is the altitude for Santo Spiritual?
The range and altitude?
It ranged between 700 and 800 meters.
700 and 800. Okay. Great.
Cool.
Cool. And because I just have one more question before I translate.
Sure, go ahead.
Because you have mentioned that Santo Spiritual and Guardiola, they have very similar soils. So
No, completely different soils.
it,
Completely different. They are adjacent. They're adjacent. The two, they touch each other, but the soils change dramatically right at the change, where the contrada
Border.
changes.
uh-huh.
You see, Santo Spirito tends to have very deep soils that are like a black talcum powder. They're ash,
Uh-huh.
and ash is quite rich, right? And so much so that I planted a lot of white there for the same reason that I mentioned before. Milo, the cluster of the white of the Caricante is loose,
Uh-huh.
whereas the Merello is very tight. So since we've been in organic since 2002, since the very beginning, and we don't use fungicides, in a very where the production tends to be, where the soil is rich and the production tends to be, rich, especially in wet years, then you get the tendencies to rot easier.
Yeah.
So the Caricante is looser and doesn't develop rot. So I planted a lot of white there because of that, because of the deep soils. Okay, as they go up towards the Guardiola, you get very, very very sandy soils and very poor soils. The wines change dramatically. So you don't get the richness of the Santo Spirito in the Guardiola, but you get the beautiful bouquets, right? So for instance, to give you an idea, a 50-year-old vine, let's say for an example, in Guardiola will be this thick. A 50-year-old vine in Santo Spirito will be this thick.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
See? So
Sure.
that makes you understand the difference in soils.
Cool.
Okay, interesting.
Go for it.
我们刚刚聊了一下第4款酒啊，就是我们今天也会在今天的酒单里面的这一款，就是 Santo Spiritual 的这一款。那么 Santo Spiritual 呢，酒庄一共有3块不同的园。那么这个3块不同的园当中呢，首先它们的共性是 Santo Spiritual， 我们刚刚提到它的花香，它的香气是非常非常诱人的。很多人呢把它形容为一个窈窕的淑女，或者是一个非常文质彬彬的女性。那么刚才 Marco 有聊到呢，就是它差不多2/3是这个它的集中感，那么还有1/3呢是它的这种芳香和它的芬芳的质感。这一款Santo Spiritual 我们首先要知道的呢是Santo Spiritual 的海拔是在差不多700到800米左右，那么它的土壤结构呢是更深的这些土壤，那么它的土壤是 black ash， 就是黑色的这种黑色的火山灰那么大家知道火山灰是更多的这个更肥沃的，所以在Santo Spiritual 你可以看到的就是它的枝叶会是更茂盛更旺盛。那么在 Santo Spiritual 呢，你可以看到它的枝干是非常粗壮的然后也是这个原因，刚刚我们有提到的，就是在我们的 Milo 这个小镇上面呢，就因为它的土壤非常肥沃，所以它的果实长势非常好。那么只有种Garigante， 因为 Garigante 它的果实的果串非常的稀疏，所以呢它不容易受这种霉菌霉病的影响，所以呢 它也可以在这一块土壤上面可以免受于这一些病虫灾害的影响而长得更好一些。那么这个也是 Center Spiritual 的它的魅力所在。那么另外一个呢，就是我们在更多在2007年的时候呢，是这个 Center Spiritual 的第一个年份。那么到了2009年的时候，其实当时啊 Center Spiritual可以说啊 Marco 做了一个非常非常惊人的壮举，因为当时没有一个人鼓励他，他开玩笑说饭桌上啊一桌人，所有人都求他说你不要再弄一个单一元了，因为我们都搞不懂这个每块单一元的名字啊，包括这个单一元后面的这个故事啊，我们也非常的头疼啊。但是他当时呢是不被理解的，但是也是他坚持下啊，到后来慢慢人们开始知道并且喝到了这个酒当中背后每一款酒原来有这么大的不同的差异，风土之间的差异。然后呢，他各种各样的酒商都找上门来，告诉他你继续酿这个不同单一元的酒吧，因为这些酒实在是太精妙了，太不一样了，风格太不同了。所以呢，这个也是我相信很多人喜欢 Etna，甚至于喜欢这个地中海的勃艮第的这一块精妙的风土的原因之一。Yeah, 是there were our audiences saying like you're such a courageous person.
Well, but you know, la fortuna aiuta gli audaci. Luck helps those who are brave and courageous.
Yeah.
And I think that's what happened to Mark. Mark, one quick, a couple of just two very quick questions before we finish. The first one is just your experience on the subject of grapes. Etna Rosso historically has been a Nerello Mascalese wine with a little Nerello Cappuccio, anywhere from 95-5, 90-10, 80-20. I find that over the last 5, 6, 7 years, people are starting to not really talk about Nerello Cappuccio anymore. They tell you that their wines are all 100% Nerello Mascalese or 95 or 98. Nerello Cappuccio is sort of being forgotten. Is that, you think, something that is because there's just not much of it, or it's there and people just don't realize?
It's because people are ignorant.
Yeah. I'm glad you said it.
Yeah, no, first of all, there's one thing that hardly anybody knows and should be known, which is that there's not only Nerello Mascalese and Nerello Cappuccio, but there's also a Nerello Mantellato that people think is the same thing as Cappuccio, but it isn't.
There you go.
And I discovered that on an old vineyard on the south side of the Etna from an old farmer, and he had enough of the Nerello Mantellato, which is completely different. I mean, it's even looking at it, the leaves are different, the grains are different, they're more oval and it's different flavor. And he had enough so that I was able to do an experiment from his vineyard, Nerello Mascalese from his vineyard, Nerello Cappuccio from his vineyard, and Nerello Mantellato from his vineyard. And the Mantellato was better than the Cappuccio in my opinion. Now, so last year I planted half a hectare of Nerello Mantellato, which I had already planted 8 years previously in Santo Spirito, in fact. And I liked it so much that I replanted it. So the real point is in my opinion, is that everybody planted a little bit of Cappuccio or Mantellato and a little bit of white with the Nerello Mascalese. Why? Again, because in certain particular areas, especially, you would find a lot more Nerello Cappuccio and Mantellato than in other places. And the reason is it gives little less alcohol, a lot less tannins. It's kind of like what Merlot is to Cabernet, and a lot of color. So it's smooth. It gives a silky feeling to the Nerello Mascalese, and particularly in alcoholic vintages or in tannic vintages, dry vintages, where you have a thick skins. The Nerello Cappuccio gives it a wonderful creamy kind of sensation. And I've learned in the last years, I've gone the opposite way. I've planted more and more. And so because you need that, there's wines, there's varieties that enjoy loneliness and varieties that enjoy company. Yeah. And Nerello Mascalese enjoys a little bit of company, I think.
Great.
And that's also, Sorry? So, yeah, and another thing I wanted to say, though, that I think will be part of the future, at least as far as I'm concerned, of the Etna. As I said before, we have a lot to learn on the whites, and that I think the whites will increase in quality dramatically and in interest, because there's going to be a lot of new places planted, and so people will come out with wines that have the same characteristic, basically of Caricante, but with different expressions. So that is going to be an interest. But one of my interests, my very important interest today, is the Etna Rosso. Why am I saying that? Because in the last 4, 5, 6 years, I've planted and I've had come into production in the last 2 years, fabulous grapes mostly all from Carterara and San Lorenzo, and some from Santo Spirito. These all coming from young vines are going to go and have gone into the Etna Rosso. So the Etna Rosso, now I've found, if you taste the 2021, for instance, it's a little bit rustic because it hasn't had enough wood for the power and the structure that it deserves, right? That it has, and therefore it deserves. So now I'm finishing, as we speak, I'm finishing a new barrel place. So, and I have barrels there waiting for the 2022 to go in there, because it's useless to produce very fine grapes if you can't then, vinify them and age them as they deserve to be aged. So what I think is, not only the whites will improve, but in my case, the Etna Rosso will improve dramatically. And already it's extremely fine, but it will start getting close and close to the cruise. Mm-hmm. It won't have the great identity of the cruise, which, like character, identity is very important, right? Because it's part of the character. So, but it will have beauty and structure and finesse and elegance and depth closer and closer to the Premier Cruise. So in a sense, it will resemble more the village of Burgundy, which not necessarily is true on Etna, because remember, the Etna Rosso that I produce or that anybody else produces can be a blend of north, south, east, and everything else. But whereas the village in Burgundy, if it's a Gevrey village, it has to belong to that commune, right? So it has a greater identity. And in general, in the hands of very fine producers in Burgundy, the very good villages come close to the Premier Cruise. And that's what's going to happen as people, if people, and pay more attention to the vineyard locations, to where, to young vines and what they can give, and so on and so forth. For instance, also sometimes a little bit of young vine wine, let's say 10% of young vine wine in an old vine wine can give it a little bit of a more jazz, a more fragrant kind of feeling, So these kind of details, which you learn in time and this and that, are what will make us improve our reds, but particularly the Etna Rosso. And I think definitely that's what's going to happen with Terre Nere.
I think it's maybe already happening to an extent that when I think back at your 2019 Etna Rosso, I noticed a real jump in quality already in that vintage. The Etna Rosso 2019 is as good as some of the crus you've made in lesser vintages. So I think I absolutely agree. I think it's better and better every year now.
Yes, it is. It is, and I think with the 2022 that will have all the barrel aging that it needs. That and by the way, 2022 for our 20th anniversary, it's an extraordinary vintage. It rivals the best vintages in the last 20 years, and it may even top them. It's an extraordinary odd vintage because of the ups and downs of the season. It kept going up and down, 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 and then a magnificent October just regulated everything and made everything equal and turned this odd creature vintage into a swan. So I think we'll find that, and I think it's, for me, that's very exciting, very, very, very exciting.
If you had to say, because maybe people aren't as aware on Etna as they are about Burgundy, Bordeaux, Barolo, your favorite vintages, the vintages you think are really great on Etna, I don't know, 11, 14, 22, which ones do you like?
I would say 2006 was a fabulous, and 2007, well, also 2008, but in a different way. And then you get these vintages that I like very much, like 2010 and 15, which seem to be ugly ducklings, but then turn out to be gorgeous vintages. Now, 2015 and 10, drinking them now, are sublime. They have the gentleness of a Burgundy and the richness and the delicate depth that you don't need anything more than that. And 16 is a great vintage, probably the greatest of all. 11 is a great vintage. 14 is over the top. 14 is too much. It's too much of a good thing is a bad, not a good thing. 2017 is not as great as 2016. It tends to be a little too wide. It's in some ways, you remember what it was, how beautiful the 96 vintage was in Barolo and Barbaresco. And then you had in the 97, which is also very beautiful, but it was wider, more generous, more opulent, a bit too much of it. Okay, exactly the same here. 16 is rigorous, beautiful, authoritative, and a bit austere. But God, what a great wine it is going to be. In fact, I'm having a Magnum tonight with friends.
Good for you.
16, but 15 next to it is not going to lose. It has a gracefulness and a charm that is, magnificent. And then 19 is a beautiful vintage. But look, I have a great friend from Burgundy, and he spent 2 or 3 days here about 5 years ago or so. And of course, we talk about wine and drink wine like there's no tomorrow. And at a certain point, he came up and said, I don't know what a great vintage is anymore. I just don't know what a great vintage is anymore. And as I keep thinking back to that, to what he said, and I think vintages in the end, and that's something people should really learn. So please translate this, because I think vintages are here for our joy. All the different vintages are here and have a reason to be here. In the old days, when there were few wines around that people tasted and drank, people prided themselves in being able to recognize the vintage. And people didn't let's say, they didn't judge vintages. They described vintages. I think that's a lot healthier.
Yeah, of course.
You describe a vintage for, whatever it is, and then people can taste it, like it, not like it, whatever. There are vintages to drink sooner, vintages to drink later, vintages that seem to be good sooner, but in fact, in 10 years, develop their own beauties. And they're all here for our pleasure.
Yeah.
And in the hands, I have my heroes in the winemaking. And my heroes are the guys that wherever I am in the world where I can find a bottle of their wine in a restaurant or in the store, whether it's a Village or a Grand Cru, whatever, and whatever vintage it is, they'll deliver joy.
Mhm.
Those are my heroes.
Very true.
And that's what my ambition is. My ambition is to be a hero for somebody else. If people say Terre Nere, they'll drink whatever wine it is, whatever vintage it is, it'll be something that will give you joy.
Mark, I think you really are a hero. I mean, not to compliment you needlessly, but I think you really are a hero to many, many people, not just wine lovers, but also wine producers, because you have now gotten Barolo producers to invest on Etna. And that is very clearly of your doing, because you blazed that path. I don't know if you're happy about that, but you did blaze that path.
I'm happy. Yeah.
We'll let Echo translate and then we'll just say goodbye. Go ahead.
那我们今天呢，刚刚有聊到2个非常重要的东西啊，然后呢，我会跟大家来翻译一下。一个呢是我们刚刚聊到了关于 Anna Rosso 这一个 Marco 自己本身也非常非常看好，甚至把它比作明日之星的这样一个新兴的存在。因为很多人呢会把 Anna Rosso 低估了它的重要性，但是实际上它并不仅仅是勃艮第的我们说大区级，甚至很多 Anna Rosso 它可以和村级1级原相提并论啊，相媲美。因为Marco 的感觉是，其实真正好的 Anna Rosso 它用同样的方法去他用特级园和1级园同样的方法去种植酿造，并且呢，给他足够多的注意力，给他足够多的这种关注，它其实是可以酿作出非常高品质的葡萄酒的。然后呢，第2个点是关于年份，其实我们刚刚聊到了很多不同的年份啊，包括我们也聊到了，比方说像1996年是巴罗洛和巴巴莱斯科最好的年份之一。那么相较而言呢，97年就没有那么出色。那么同样，其实在 Anna 这块土地上也同样存在着哪一些年份更好，哪一些年份次好。那比方说我们说到的大年份就是2016年啊，然后呢再比方说我们刚刚提到的2011年、2014年都是非常伟大的年份。那么相较而言呢，比方说2017年它就没有那么的好啊，可能在成熟度上面呢会有一些稍稍的过于成熟。但是呢，最重要的是我觉得刚刚Marco 总结了这句话是非常非常的精辟的，那就是关于对于年份的这样一个评论啊，他有提到就是 all vintages are here for joy and pleasure。那么这句话意思就是说，其实所有的年份是其实不要去紧盯着年份哪一个是大年，哪一个是小年而紧追不放，因为其实每一个年份都是为了我们终极的喝葡萄酒得到的快乐和愉悦感啊。然后第2句话呢就是其实人们people should not judge the vintage, but describe the vintage。就是不应该去对某一个年份去做一个好像评判这个是好年，或者是那个是坏年，而更多的其实我们都是在去很客观的去说这个年份给你带来的是哪些感受。这个感受可能是非常愉悦的，那也有可能是让你有更多的深思这个年份当中经历的很多高低低起起伏伏。那所有这些其实它都是对于年份的真实的一个反应，它并没有好坏。我觉得这个就跟处理人生当中的一些低谷的时候也是一个道理，其实并没有所谓的好事情或者是坏事情，或者是好事或者是绝对的这一些困难或者低谷，因为很多时候其实是我们看事情的眼光和态度来决定了所有我们对待年份也好因为不可能每一个年份都是风调雨顺。那么我们如何去面对这一些高低低起起伏伏的时候，其实才是我们真正人生的真意吧。
Okay.
So
do I have the time to say two more things?
for sure.
Sure, of course.
Okay. A few more things, just two more things. One thing is that I think is important is what makes one person's wines different from another person's wines in the same place or whatever. It's a question of culture. And, you know, if you ask me what culture is, it's a difficult thing to describe, but it's basically like a suitcase that you carry through the travels of your life. And it's full of everything that you've learned and everything that you've picked up and everything that you are. And all these things that you carry with you determine the decisions that you make. When you plant, from the moment that you plant a vine to the moment that you're harvesting the grapes and when you harvest them and what you do and then the choices and when you're making the wine. Everything, how you age it, how you fine it, you don't fine it, you filter it, you don't filter, everything is determined by this baggage that you carry with you, a backpack that makes up, you know, whatever your life is. And that's what makes things different from the wines that I make to somebody else who makes it, because you decide what is important for you and what, you know, and that is determined by what you do and what you've done all your life. And then eventually, you know, you learn, it's a learning process in humility. You find out that you don't, you know, you believe that you own the vineyard, but in fact, you're just the caretaker. You know, the vineyard is more important, lasts much longer. Yeah. You know, you don't know why the hell you're planting a vineyard. When I'm 70 years old, I'm planting a vineyard. I'm not certainly planting it for myself, you know, but you perpetuate something. And that makes you humble, you know, and it makes you understand that you have to, at a certain point, and it's the hardest thing to do, I think. You have to, at a certain point, let go. You have to let it be. After you've learned this, you've concentrated this and that, there's a tension that usually comes up during the harvest. And you have to be able to let go and let it be, you know, because otherwise it gets in your way. And so I'll end with a little quote from your friend Chuang-Tzu. Okay? Wow. And he said, the wonderful thing, he said that your life has a limit, but knowledge has no limit. So if you pursue what has no limit with what has a limit, you will be in trouble.
Yeah.
And if you understand that and you continue, you'll be in trouble for sure. So you have to let it go a little bit, you know. You just have to let it, you know, everything a little bit relax, and the wine will be more relaxed as well. It will carry less tension.
Cool.
Wow, it's so beautiful.
There you go.
Go for it. Thank you.
For the really, I mean, it's kind of like an epiphany live stream, I would say. A lot of like touching sentences that we want to share with our audience. 我们今天晚上呢非常的开心，因为就是我们在节目的尾声啊，要给大家来再聊一个话题呢，就是 Marco 刚刚聊到的，就是他的一些关于对于酒庄，对于他自己本身的一些哲学道理在里面。那么其中有一个就是关于他如何去对待他自己所拥有的这些成就。我觉得我到目前为止，其实我听到很多他的自己本身的一些哲学哲思在里面。一个呢，就是我体会到的是他散发出来的这种humble，我觉得他真的是一个 虽然做了非常非常多的事情，也拥有很大的成就，但是同时呢，他非常的谦卑。就有一点是他告诉我们的，就是let go， 就是放手，让这一些自然而然的东西去流入出他自己本来应该有的样子。那么其中有一点呢，他有提到说，其实人生，在世有很多东西其实并不是我们可以决定得了的，而是我们背着这个行囊这个行囊里面可能有许许多多的东西，那么这些东西你背着的这个行囊决定了你最终会成为一个什么样的人，你会去做哪一些事情，然后所有的这些追求其实真正是很多时候真正是这一个可能是一生，你会用一生来慢慢解答，然后它会慢慢闪现的一些东西。那么然后呢，第二个点是在于他刚刚有提到的，就是很多时候呢，作为一个庄主，大家都知道，其实一年当中最最重要的就是当你收获的时候，那么大家都是会有非常多的这个紧张在里面。我觉得这个也像我们平时生活、学习、工作当中，会有很多的这些瞬间，我们可能觉得说这个是决定了我们生死命运相关的，或者是一些考试，或者是一些非常重大的挑战。那么Marco 也分享了他自己的经历，就是他其实觉得当你真正放松的时候，当你真正体验当下、感受当下的时候，其实那个才是真正你收获最多的时候。所以不需要太紧张，或者是太过于执着于这个结果而是享受当下的每时每刻。我觉得这个也是给了我非常启发的一句话。然后另外呢，就是 Marco 送给大家一个他非常喜欢的中国哲人的庄子的一句话，就是呢 Your life has a limit, but knowledge has no limit， 就是你的生命其实是有限度的，它是会结束的。那么知识呢，是一个无穷无尽的这样一个存在。那么如果你去用有限的生命我们去追求无限的这个知识的时候，其实我们真正追求的都是我们一个我们精神上的极致的一些东西。但是千万要记住，就是刚刚 Marco 分享给我们的一个，就是对于生命的谦卑，对于万事万物，对于宇宙的谦卑。然后另外一个就是活在当下。这个2句话也送给大家，也送给所有的在疫情期间正在体验着非常多的艰难的我们。Yeah, so Marcos, thank you so much, because you have give us a lot of endless wisdom as well, especially at this COVID time. You know, in Shanghai, everybody's quite difficult. And we have really learned a great deal from you. Not only we know that actually we have a lot of thankfulness getting actually exactly from yesterday, like people mentioned you and how grateful they are. And today we want to express our joy and also our
thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy your dinner with your friends and your magnum. And I ought to be in Italy early on in 2023. I'll make sure I give you a call and fix an appointment, and I'll come down.
With great pleasure. Take care.
Thank you so
Devo
much.
tornare.
Grazie, Ian. Ciao.
Grazie. Thank you.
A voi. Ciao.